continental US or, continental North America. Like if you start to look further afield in terms of time zones, then it opens up different geographies. I mean, I've had folks in Brazil, even at Carta. I've had folks in Rio. At another company, I had folks in Argentina, maybe considering Mexico City. And New York is maybe sort of adjacent to thinking about Peru or Argentina or Brazil.
Welcome to the Remote Teams Advisor, the podcast where tech leaders share the real stories behind building high-performing global engineering teams. In today's episode, we're joined by Ron Pragides, a seasoned engineering executive who's led teams at Salesforce, Twitter, and Carta. We talk about scaling across borders, leading with intention, and what most companies get wrong about global hiring. Let's get into it. All right, so today I'm joined by Ron Pragides, an engineering leader who's helped scale teams at companies like Salesforce, Twitter, and most recently a series of high-growth startups. So we're going to dive into what it really takes to build and lead distributed engineering teams, from hire across borders to keeping quality high without slowing down product velocity. If you're a CTO, startup founder, just thinking about how to make global engineering work, this conversation is full of practical insights you won't want to miss. So now I want to introduce Ron. Ron, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for asking me.
Yeah. So obviously the Remote Teams Advisor, that's where we want to dive into how today's best engineering leaders are thinking about remote teams, building distributed teams, driving performance, and building cultures that last. I've looked through your past work experience. You've been at a variety of companies, both small and large. But one thing that seems to come up across all of them is geography. You've built and scaled teams in maybe almost every continent. I don't think I saw Antarctica on there. But I wanted to pick your brain on how you identify these markets. I'm assuming some of them you're coming in and you're inheriting teams and maybe some you're building from scratch. But before we get into any of that, I want to hear about what it was like. Where did you grow up? Where did you go to school? And where did your kind of career even start?
Oh, cool. Hey, thanks for asking me that. It's been a while. I'm going to have to dust the cobwebs out of my brain. So I was born in Chicago, center of the country. I got my undergrad at University of Illinois, not a bad little university to go to. There's some really smart people that went there. I also happen to have gone there. But yeah, Mark and Andreessen's famously from there, Max Levchin, a whole bunch of luminaries, like the founders of Yelp. I was happy to just be part of that, like the whole university system. My first job out of university was actually at Texas Instruments. So I moved from Illinois to Dallas, Texas, spent 3.5 years in Dallas. And there I was doing a whole bunch of stuff in like hardware design, board design, chip level design, as well as firmware engineering. So like full stack, because my undergrad was in electrical engineering. And at least for me, what I found out early on in my career was I was drawn towards the past iterations of software development. So even though I had an electrical engineering degree and eventually got a master's in it as well, I was really drawn to algorithms and software and the quick iteration paces of that. So that was my first 3.5 years in career. Then I moved to the Bay Area just because like the bright lights of Silicon Valley. And if you can make it here, you can make it anywhere. Maybe not New York, but okay, the nerds version of New York was the Bay Area. I moved to San Francisco in 1995 for Sun Microsystems. And then after Sun Microsystems, about 3 years there, I joined a 100-person startup. And so that began my sort of journey into privately held companies, mostly startups and scale-ups.
Wow. You mentioned University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. I had never come across that until a few years ago, but when I started doing research on a lot of the tech luminaries, You mentioned Mark Andreessen, Larry Ellison, Max Levchin. I think you could probably name yourself as one of them, perhaps, in some regard. So what is it about, you were an electrical engineering major. And one question I have for you is, with everything going on with NVIDIA and the various LLMs that are coming out, if you were in university today, would you still choose electrical engineering or would you choose computer science or something else?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Like, interestingly enough, like LMs and machine learning, AI, it's been a long time coming, but really the ChatGPT moment that happened just a few years ago hit the world by storm. Machine learning's been a thing for a long time, natural language processing as well. And so I guess what I would recommend is just follow your own interests. For me personally, I knew that when I was going into undergrad, I knew that I like math. I knew I like computers. I didn't know exactly what that meant. I didn't know if I wanted to do hardware or software. So I did electrical engineering just because like it seemed like the right thing to do. And at the time back then, maybe what was a good analogy for AI and LLMs today was digital signal processing. And that was something that I was interested in. And so that was something that was firmly in the realm of electrical engineering, although it straddles the line of both hardware and software. Like you have to understand how the chip works and the registers work to implement your algorithms on it. And so I think that's a good analogy. Today, honestly, I think it really depends on what someone's passionate about. If someone is really, like I found, really more interested in the quick turnaround times of software that enables, then I would go for computer science. But if you really want to, if you're concerned or interested in chip design, hardware design, like the actual bits and bytes of what makes things work at the hardware software interface level, then I would say electrical.
Okay. Wonderful. And then jumping ahead to just where you've built and managed teams, you started off your career at Texas Instruments. I presume you were working on some sort of calculator at the time. And then you went over to Sun Microsystems, so very like hardware focused companies. And then to some of your most recent gigs being a little bit less hardware focused. So how have things evolved maybe in terms of building and managing teams on a global scale? Did you see that before the dot-com boom? What's been I imagine things have changed a lot since then.
Yeah, things have changed a ton. And even just going back to Texas Instruments, my first role there was actually in the defense subcontracting arm. Like people didn't know that, but Texas Instruments had a big defense division. And so I was part of that, had a secret clearance and all of that sort of jazz. And it's interesting, like now maybe it's coming back into style with Palantir and some other companies. But no, in the like earlier days, everything was about being local, having localized teams. And especially if you're working on things that are like sensitive, okay, maybe related to defense subcontracting, then definitely anchor on being US based and having US citizens and having that whole deep diligence in terms of who's working on these products. And even moving to the Bay Area in the mid-90s, it was still pretty much the same of, okay, I'm joining this company, I'm part of this headquarters, I'm going here every single day, and we're working together. And a lot of this is because the internet wasn't fully formed yet, and neither was video conferencing. It was even a while before Skype became a thing. And I think just this week, Microsoft announced they're finally going to put Skype to rest. But maybe the acceleration of this global phenomenon, which I saw even during the Salesforce days, but what really became more pronounced as everyone realizes around the COVID timeframe, where we couldn't get together for safety reasons. And so the technology progressed to a certain point and the apps had progressed to a certain point where we could actually leverage things like Slack and Zoom to do this communication. And it just opened up the masses towards remote work.
Yeah. So it sounds like in your early days, like national security, defense, not really industries that maybe are looking to build global remote distributed engineering teams as much for some of the fundamental reasons, and also from a technology perspective, at that point, there weren't video conferencing, maybe even communication platforms that were as robust as we have today. At what point, I think you mentioned maybe Salesforce was when you started to see maybe or experience some more kind of distributed teams. What were some of the things that you saw coming on the market at that point, or some of the things that enabled distributed teams to come to light?
Yeah. And even in the early days of Salesforce, we were still very much HQ focused, HQ centric. But over time, as the years progressed, Mark had it in his head that he wanted to grow not just organically, but also strategically through acquisitions. And so we dipped our toe in the water by doing small acqui-hires and small tuck-ins. And in many cases, we would actually relocate those folks to San Francisco to be part of the core team. But then as time progressed, the acquisitions got to be larger. They were bigger teams, and it suddenly wasn't that feasible to say, all right, this team all the way up in Vancouver, we're going to move everybody down to San Francisco. And so that's where, at least with Salesforce, as we acquired teams, we also looked at the geos. We also started to acquire teams and left them in place. Maybe we'd move a few people over to headquarters in San Francisco, but that's where we started to really expand our footprint and to think about, okay, not just one office and headquarters, but maybe an office and some satellite locations. And starting easily with Canada as our first step into that pool, and then like other parts of the US, and then eventually further afield.
Yeah, and that's interesting because it seems like you had early experience in the M&A world at Salesforce, helping. You did some acqui-hires, maybe you acquired whole companies and maybe didn't relocate them back to San Francisco, maybe in Canada you mentioned. So that's a strategy that I think some larger companies or larger startups are definitely considering, going that more strategic route. There's opportunities where you don't have to set up a legal entity, you don't need to set up bank accounts, all that's already in place. So it saves you some time and some legal expense. There's also some earlier stage companies that you may be advising today that they're just they don't want to get their lawyer on to do an acqui-hire even or make it an acquisition because they're not as familiar with the process and all the variables that might come in. Yeah, tell me a little bit more about that experience at Salesforce, like how you look at an acqui-hire or an acquisition to fuel some of your engineering growth.
Yeah, and even when we at Salesforce we started doing it, we weren't necessarily a giant company quite yet, although it is today. But back then, it's early days, and so some of our first acquisitions were like, okay, maybe the entire team is 5 people, or certainly less than 10 people, right? And so even if you're not a giant company, if there's a startup that's in an adjacent space that looks like they might be accretive in terms of the team and technology, and maybe even like the product focus, and they're small enough, then you can even do an acquisition or an acqui-hire with some sort of stock swap, right? At purely equity, or maybe even like granting more share grants, or maybe even something like maybe even positioning as we like your team, but we're actually not going to use your product. And so here's a bunch of great offers for every single person on the team, or at least maybe the engineering portion of the team. So even if you're not a giant company, there's ways to structure it such that you can still think of it as hunting for talent, just in a different way.
So for you, I'm curious, were those deals coming to you? Were you going out and seeking them with being the executive sponsor at Salesforce to find them? Or were you just, I'm sure you had your normal kind of recruiting pipelines running too. So where did that fit in and how did they come to you or how'd you get them?
Yeah. And I have different things to share here. So at Salesforce, there the process was either our investors would approach us with some ideas because maybe some of their portfolio companies would be a good match for us. In other cases, maybe it was from the product side where someone was developing a product roadmap and product ideas, and they were scanning the landscape to see who are players in this product area and how can they potentially accelerate our development in those areas. And then later on in Salesforce's trajectory, the acquisitions got much and much bigger, then it came to, okay, maybe there's a company out there that has customers with recurring revenue that would be great to bring in, and we would just continue to run the company in total. So that's on the Salesforce side. But then I'm thinking ahead to some other companies that I've worked at where, yeah, I was at a Series C startup and I was running the entire engineering team. And I knew that we needed to inject some new talent and some different thinking about technology. And there happened to be a startup where it was a small startup, less than 10 people, but think certainly more than half, but like a majority of their customers were also customers of our platform. And so that was one thing where, oh, we have a bunch of shared customers and you've got some interesting technology. And I personally would like to augment my team with some of that thinking. There's lots of things there where it looked like that team and our team could align because we had basically a shared mission, a shared user base that we were trying to target.
Would you say, because I have my own founder friends who've gone through on both sides, the acquisitions or being acquired, and they can be, whether it's included with fundraising or just trying to find an exit, it could be a little distracting. And I'd imagine for you too, folks might perceive it as this can be a very distracting effort. We don't know if it's going to happen. Are there any ways you can de-risk? I think you mentioned a few maybe already. If they have an overlapping customer base, if maybe your M&A team has already done a bunch of diligence and kind of has the questions you want answered, but what are the things that you're trying to get answered up front where it's not going to waste your time otherwise?
I'm going to go back to that example where there was the small team, less than 10 folks, and they were mission aligned with us. And from our perspective, like I wanted to bring these folks on. They're really great folks, really great talent, lots of great ways that they were thinking about the market, but their product was not going to be a fit for us. So even like we would wanted to use their technology and their thinking, but not necessarily all of the product they had built. And so for us, I would say it wasn't us, the acquirer, it wasn't that distracting because we knew exactly what we wanted, which was this team. I guess for the team, that startup team, the target themselves, they had a lot of sort of soul searching to do, which was, do they want to join us? Do they want to forego this product they've been building over the last several years that they had a lot of time invested into for the notion of joining us, but with this shared mission of serving the same end customer? And so for them, it was more of a concern. And really, yeah, do they do this thing? They were trying to build like this really wide product footprint, and we were going to focus on maybe a third of what they were doing, but pour resources into it. And in terms of the distraction, I think that the distraction was more on their side with respect to, yeah, is this really what we want to do? And to be honest, it was a long courtship. It was probably, I don't know, probably 4 months. Maybe that's not so long, but in startup speed, it felt long to me, where I was trying to get them over the line to convince them to join us, and they eventually did.
Nice. Cool. And we haven't gone through a lot of your other experience, but we spoke a lot about Salesforce, some of those acquisitions that you had been a part of. You also went on to Twitter, BigCommerce, AppDirect, Trustly, Carta, where you had teams in a lot of different places, some of which were in the United States, at Carta, San Francisco, Palo Alto, New York. So maybe we actually touch on that first. So there's a lot of companies that are obviously being funded in the Valley or in New York, and that's where their core kind of teams start out. Maybe they even move from New York to San Francisco if they go through YC. And they start there, but then they say, okay, it's really competitive here in San Francisco. We have a friend that we used to work with, but he doesn't live here. Let's maybe give him a shot. We know he's high quality. So I guess when you're at places like Carta or maybe some other, I'm not sure what other companies you've been at where you've had multiple locations in the US, how do you think about maybe that as compared to going international? Do you have any experience evaluating whether you stay US centric or you start to look abroad?
Look, at the end of the day, you're at a company, whether it's a startup or a bigger company, and you're trying to do as much as possible with the resources you have. And by resources, okay, the funding that you have. And so it's a balance between, okay, balancing the checkbook, and then also looking at what you want to accomplish in terms of the product roadmap and the capabilities. And then also the other asset, which is your team. Like, how are you going to build the team? And as you're building the team, how are you going to think about culture? And part of that is also how you communicate across all these different geographies. And frankly, if it's San Francisco to New York or San Francisco to Sao Paulo in Brazil, it's actually not that different. Like, it's actually literally 1 hour difference between New York and Brazil. And I like to think of it in terms of time zones with respect to the culture and the communication. And so if you're already doing something that's spanning the continental US or continental North America, if you start to look further afield in terms of time zones, then it opens up different geographies, different places where you can start to staff. And South America, for I think the longest time, has been just sitting there in their backyard, and people hadn't thought that much about staffing down there. But there's great talent. There's great talent down there. I've had folks in Brazil, even at Carta. I've had folks in Rio. And so we had an engineering team there as well as operation folks. Had another company, had folks in Argentina. I know there's one of the companies that I advise, and I know that they have a lot of staffing that's coming out of Mexico. And so that's even closer. That's pretty much like Central Time Zone. And so if you're already accustomed to thinking about, okay, maybe I should have a team in Chicago or New York. Chicago is like adjacent to like maybe considering Mexico City, and New York is maybe adjacent to thinking about, I don't know, Peru or Argentina or Brazil. And if you start to think about more than just, is it latitude or longitude, but think about just the different ways you can try to grow and try to keep that communication loop tight. That's really, I think, where like the term nearshoring really makes a ton of sense versus going further afield in terms of time zone.
Right. Because I find a lot of execs are looking at, okay, if they're EST to PST, if we're open to hiring within the continental US, then most North and South America makes sense. If the developers are technically proficient, can pass your skills assessments or coding assessments, that's great. And if they can speak or communicate enough with our team in English, then we can open ourselves up to not only just one market, a lot of different markets if we feel comfortable with it. So have you found any of the other maybe facets of evaluating individuals or identifying individuals to be a bit more difficult when you are going outside the US, that maybe are just a little bit more nuanced, or there's just a bit of learnings that you wish you had before you started hiring in these other markets?
You touched upon one of them already, which was like, okay, the English language proficiency, because of course we're in the US, and like with Canada, which has historically been where people have looked to for additional staffing, obviously we share a common language. When you start to look at LATAM, then that starts to be a question. And so that's part of the evaluation process, quite frankly, is, okay, how well can we communicate with our team down there, whether it's product or design or engineering? How quickly can we get like the ideas across such that they can take full ownership, or at least a majority ownership of what they're building? And so that becomes an additional screen, I guess you'd have to say. And there's different ways to do it as well, which is, okay, maybe traditionally if you're staffing up in North America, then the expectation is that everyone is fluent in English. For me personally, I've been in situations where at the very least the tech lead and the managers have to be really great at English proficiency so they can communicate with me, communicate with product managers, but maybe they serve as a little bit of a translation layer to the rest of the engineering team. Not to say that the engineers shouldn't have any knowledge of English, but maybe they don't have to be quite as proficient as the folks that are going to be the main touch points with the folks up in the US.
Sure. Okay. And I think you're referencing tech leads or managers maybe in these other countries that you've gone out and
Yeah.
hired that are reporting into US counterparts. Is that something that you advocate for when you're advising companies or doing it on your own, like hiring maybe a site lead or a tech lead to start a partnership or start that kind of international expansion? Or have you seen it where maybe you parallel track IC hiring with some tech leads, given it takes a little bit longer? And yeah.
Okay. So if you're in general, my advice is, yeah, you should definitely have some management structure or leadership structure locally because people want to look to someone locally for some of that. But in terms of sequencing, I don't think there's necessarily a hard and fast rule about how to do that. It all depends. If you're really patient and you want to go start out by saying, right, first I need a manager slash tech lead in this location, then you can certainly do that. It's just going to prolong the entire life cycle. Or you can certainly say, I'm going to be opportunistic and I'm going to hire mid to senior level ICs and opportunistically look for that manager or tech lead. But even if I don't find that leader sort of archetype, I'm still going to be staffing up. And so I really think it depends on what your time frame is and what you're trying to accomplish.
Okay. And I think you mentioned Brazil, Rio, you mentioned Argentina. I think you ran Buenos Aires there, Portugal, maybe, I don't know if you had Sweden at one point, if that was engineering or a different team. You've done Sydney, Australia. I don't know, I'm probably missing, I think India, you've also built teams in. So what are, I don't know, maybe tell me if I missed a couple, definitely. And then also tell me out of those that I've just mentioned, what are some of the highlights for you when you think about those markets and the differences among them?
Yeah. So I've integrated or at least worked with teams in India, Canada, of course, our closest neighbor, Argentina, Brazil, Portugal, Sweden. Let's see, have I missed anyone? Oh, actually a team in France during my time at Salesforce. I'm going to miss a few, but yeah, so lots of different places. They've generally been Northern Hemisphere. More recently, it's been Southern Hemisphere with respect to South America. It's fascinating. We're all the same and yet we're all different. We're all human. We have the same basic needs and we all are striving to do some great work. But each country has its own kind of different culture. And maybe you can even zoom into just the US and say, all right, California culture is different than Florida culture. And maybe even within California, San Francisco culture is different than Los Angeles culture. And so the same thing is there across the entire world. It's just probably pretty more pronounced. Like even San Francisco versus Toronto, there's slightly different nuances. And certainly like San Francisco to Sydney, okay, we all speak English as our common language, but okay, maybe the phrasing is different and maybe like the sense of humor is different and like the demeanor is different. So even there's things you have to adapt to. And then with South America, one thing that struck me as particularly fascinating is just how, in my opinion, like it's a very like really warm culture, really close. And it's almost like when you join a company down there, it's almost like it's an extension of the family down there, which is very different than, for example, like a New York or a San Francisco where, all right, we're building teams. We're not about family. We're about like eyes on the prize and the objective. And so I think maybe just one takeaway is like understanding where you're operating and what the environment is for the folks that are in each of these environments and how to interact with them to get the most out of them. And maybe even just one final observation is like India. I've had teams in India a couple times and they're all the way around the globe. They're 12 hours away from us in San Francisco on the West Coast. And with that time delay, with that distance, like the communication transom is such that everything has to be pretty well scripted and parsed out and lined out. And we've been dealing with India as US businesses have been dealing with India for a long time. And there's just been some norms about how you communicate across that great expanse. And it has to be very prescriptive. And so that's something that you have to know about India. And that's how you get the most out of that. As I just mentioned earlier, with respect to time zones, the closer you get in terms of time zone distance, then the less you have to write everything down and have this whole checklist. And the more turns into a bit of hopefully a conversation. Certainly, if you have a team in San Francisco, Vancouver, you're in the same time zone. And so you can just have real-time meetings. And the closer you get to that ideal, the more close to real time you get. But even if you're just 1 hour, 2 hour, 3 hours removed, you just have to understand that gives you that much more that you have to document and or like that much more that you can still have those two-way conversations as long as there's some time.
Are you often visiting your team? Are they visiting you? Or is it mainly all virtual? What kind of expectations do you set for yourself or for your teams?
I think it depends. If there is a sizable group of folks in a particular location or a particular region, then I think there has to be some FaceTime. And generally, if it's a larger group, then me and some product managers would travel to them on, I don't know, maybe a quarterly basis, maybe a couple times a year. If it's on the flip side, if it's actually a small group, let's say like a 5-person squad that's in some part of the world, in that case, it's not too burdensome to bring all 5 of them up to visit you in the US because it's a small number of folks and they get to experience like what life's like up here interact with more people in headquarters and understand the environment. So I think it depends on the size of the team and how far they are. And that's another thing too. If it's a team that's all the way around the world, maybe the travel is just once a year. If it's a team that's closer, then maybe you can do a couple, 2 or 3 times a year. And then depending on the size of the team that's there, maybe you go to them versus them coming to you.
Sure. And there's a lot of, especially in South America, there's a lot of markets where you can fly direct or one connection from San Francisco or New York. And I think that's something that maybe just everyone doesn't have experience with, but they're often, if they are working distributed already in the US, all you do is have to book a flight. And oftentimes they're taking vacation on the side too. They're getting to enjoy new cultures, learn. And for you, I'd even say like your portfolio is built up so much where you mentioned like 15 different countries you've built teams in. I assume that's why companies probably look to you to advise them. They're like, Ron's done it everywhere. He knows probably a lot. And I'm assuming, traveled to many of these destinations yourself. You have a really good read on a lot of these locations, what teams can be built and the advantages to each. I think it's just crossing that barrier of knowing that they're not that far away. But you don't have to travel and visit them every month. It could be every 6 months, every quarter, depending on the size and the distance.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And I'm even forgetting, I was thinking about all the different places I've been. And so one of the most interesting places to me was like actually going to Israel and being in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, where I hadn't thought I would ever do that. But at Salesforce, we happened to acquire actually a couple teams out in Israel and got to visit there and learned a lot, honestly.
Yeah. When it comes to, because a lot of folks bring up like Brazil and when you think about South America and the main language being Portuguese, has that brought any additional complications as compared to other South American countries? I'm not sure if at that point when you were working in Brazil, if you had other South American counterparts that primarily spoke Spanish, but I'm curious how that 2 or 3 language mix pans out.
Yeah. And I even know that there's some companies that are like augmenting their teams with folks in different countries in South America where, okay, in Brazil, the language is Portuguese primarily, but in the rest of South America, it's Spanish. And so, yeah, some companies have had to deal with like multiple languages, but the common denominator is that they all baseline on English. And so whether you're in a Spanish speaking country or Portuguese speaking country, if you're working with folks up in the US, then you have to communicate as English as the company language. But yeah, you raise a really good point, which is, yeah, I think just by virtue of the language distribution in South America, generally, it's probably easier maybe for you to work with primarily Spanish speaking countries, because Portuguese is just a little more nuanced, a little less well understood. But it also depends on how well you screen for that English language capability.
Are there any things that you do specifically for screening for English language proficiency that you found more effective than others? Or is it just let me hop on a screener with the candidate and make sure that I can understand them?
I think, I'm not going to speak out of turn, but I think Terminal does a really great job in terms of doing that screening. I myself, and when I've had teams down there, I've been fortunate enough to actually have HR support as part of my teams. And so they've managed that whole English language screening process, but I'm sure there's different ways to do it. It hasn't necessarily been just me, to be honest.
Right. And that was actually what I wanted to ask you about next. So dealing with cross-functional teammates, you have your people team, your HR team, finance, legal, maybe your product leadership, if you're not overseeing that. How is it working with other cross-functional stakeholders when you're either considering going into another market, especially when you're considering going to another market or you're in one? Like, what do they care about? Can they block you on the engineering side, or are they leading some of these evaluations as opposed to engineering, or how have you seen that work?
Yeah, I think it depends on the company you're with and how you think about it. And actually, if you're not part of let me put it this way, I guess if you're part of a really giant company, then maybe where you staff engineering is maybe more within your control as an engineering leader. But maybe the smaller the organization you are, you really need to get on the same page with the different heads of departments. And so if you're in a very small company and you're saying, oh, I want to staff up my team, not just in North America, but also in LATAM, then my opinion is you really need to get on the same page with your product folks, your HR team, even your finance team about you making this move. because it's going to change the shape and the character of the company. Especially the smaller the company is, then the larger proportion of the team it's going to end up being. And so it really changes the way you think about maybe more than just being remote first, but like international first in terms of how you communicate.
Sure. And yeah, I was going to ask, like, how do you choose a market? What are you looking for? Or does the market choose you? In the case of an M&A, you might not care as much about the market. You care about the team. You care about how they fit into your business. In other cases, maybe you're just saying, hey, we're struggling with hiring. The US doesn't seem to be it for us. And we've heard that or maybe like we have an uncle, or I grew up in this country and I have a network here, we should go here, and we're not even going to follow the data. Do you choose the market? Does the market choose you?
Yeah, that's a really good one. And I was at one company where, okay, turns out the founder CTO was from a particular small town on the east coast of Brazil. And so when he started the company in the US, in California, he seeded it with an engineering team out in Brazil just by people that he knew. And so there it was really about familiarity and people that he trusted. That became the genesis of like how we grew that engineering team in Brazil. In another case, there was a company I was a part of where even before I joined, they scoured, the lore was that they scoured the planet for, okay, where are we going to find really great talent in Python? And they landed on like Brazil and in Rio. And so they happened to just go in cold looking for their first hire in Rio. And that's where they ended up starting to grow a team. And so I think it can be both. I think it can be like situational about, okay, familiarity and who I know, like I have an uncle in Brazil or whatever. But in other cases, it could be like data driven in terms of like, all right, where are the skill sets? Where is there the right population? And maybe even where are there other companies, or where is there already an ecosystem where it's like a good fishing ground, like good hunting ground for finding the talent for people that think in this product oriented way.
When it comes to, because we talked about M&A, I think it's a little implicit here where we're talking about going out and maybe recruiting on your own with your internal team, or maybe you're doing it through your no network. But like where do like third parties fit in? There's recruiting firms maybe in these other markets. There's outsourced managed service providers, depending on where you're at with your product and where you want to go. That could be a good option. Have you used those other sorts of solutions outside of M&A and going at it on your own?
Yes, usually not from a cold call. We're all human, and like we trust references more
Sure.
than just someone that's coming in hot with an email or a phone call saying, "Hey, I've got a great team for you. Would you be interested?" Like I've never really formed a business relationship that way. It's always been like a warm intro to someone who's used a service before and they're trusted, and so they're making this introduction to me. That's just generally how I've seen it.
Okay, great. Cool. I want to jump ahead, just maybe culminate things with I don't think you're currently working full time at any company, but you're doing a lot of advisory work. You're an investor in the go-to-market fund and you advise a bunch of other companies on the side. What are you seeing in terms of the companies that you're investing in? Are they primarily early stage? And if so, how are they? What is maybe is there a spectrum that you're seeing in terms of how they're going about building their teams?
Yeah, yeah. And there's a few, and there's a couple that like stick out in my mind that I'm actively advising right now that I'm also an investor in. And one of them is based in the US, but even though they have an office, they also first looked remote in the US. And so they started to assemble folks across the country. And then they've followed up by augmenting the engineering team with a group in LATAM. And yeah, most of their engineers, I think, are still in the US, but they've experimented with LATAM augmentation with fits and starts. Like they've found some places that worked for them, some places that didn't. And they're doubling down on the geos that have worked for them. So that's one company. There's another company that's in my head too. And this one is founded in Australia, but they are global first. Like most of their teams in Australia, but they have some folks in Portugal and they have some folks in South America as well as the US. And maybe that's a reflection of the fact that, okay, it's a company that's founded outside of the US, but the US is a giant market. And so they know they have to service the US. And so they have some folks here, they have some folks in South America to service the US, but then they also have teams that are on either side of the US that are complementing that.
Interesting. Yeah. So it seems like you see a lot of that, and that could differ company to company depending on where they're coming from, what they're trying to do. When it comes to just like what you're excited about looking ahead, I'm sure you're seeing a lot of exciting new innovation. I know that you do a lot of writing on both LinkedIn and I think on Medium as well. What excites you? What gets you up every day? Any things that people should be following along these days?
We're recording this in May of 2025. And okay, we're all talking about AI and the effects of AI. And it's really interesting. And in fact, like I was just watching on TV, there's some like talking heads, some pundits on the financial news shows, and they're all talking about like NVIDIA and the hyperscalers and AI, and is there demand and is it overblown? How much is it changing? And what's happening with Google search? And is Google search going to go by the wayside in favor of people going directly to LLMs to ask questions or maybe not ask questions, but like get answers? And it's fascinating because the kind of work before where you'd have to remember when you go to the library and do research, or when you'd have to pour through all these different documents and synthesize an idea and then try to compile it and then present your thoughts. Actually, just last night, I was curious. Maybe you saw this. I posted this. I was like, oh, I wonder who are the largest holders of US treasuries. And I put it into an LLM. I went to a different LLM and did some cross-checking, and then had the LLM actually, it went off and did some searches on different pools of information and brought it back and even generated a graph for me. And so that's something that would have taken, who knows, I don't know, maybe half a day for a person to do, but it was available in a matter of minutes across multiple LLMs to cross-check each other. So I think it's fascinating that you can actually do that. And hopefully that's just going to be something that unlocks more potential for what can be done in a short period of time.
Yeah. Wow. It's definitely an exciting time in technology, especially with companies being able to hire across the globe. And so there's never been a better time, I think, to find the right talent for your team. And I think that you have to go through the trials and tribulations, figuring it out, taking some risk, and just understanding where these folks come from, what it's like to in their shoes. But if you find them, there's quite a bit of advantages to building quickly at scale. I appreciate you taking the time today, Ron, to share a bunch of your experience with us. I know there's a lot of founders and engineering executives that kind of learn a lot from you, and hopefully they'll start with today's conversation. And then where's the best place, like if they want to reach out to you, hear about your experience and your thoughts, like where can they find you and reach out to you?
Oh, you can find me on LinkedIn. You have to spell my name there. It's going to be hard. Or you can find me on X, formerly known as Twitter. My handle there is pretty easy. It's MRP, like Mr. P. So that's easy. That's easy to spell.
All right. Perfect. Ron, thanks so much for your time today, and we'll talk again soon.
That's great. Thanks, Colin.